Welcome to Life Stories, where we explore tales of love, resilience, and the human spirit. In today's story, we journey to the Sterling estate, a grand mansion where Liam Sterling, a man hardened by loss and isolation, crosses paths with Charlotte Hayes, a woman whose quiet strength hides a past of struggle and sacrifice. As their worlds collide, they discover the power of vulnerability, the beauty of connection, and the courage it takes to heal. Join us as we unravel this heartfelt tale of transformation and hope. Subscribe to Life Stories to follow this captivating journey. Let's begin today's story. The rain fell relentlessly, streaking the tall windows of the Harrison estate, a grand Victorian-style mansion that stood in stately isolation on the outskirts of Boston. Inside, the sound of the downpour echoed through the silent, cavernous hallways, adding an almost poetic melancholy to the home of one of the most powerful men in the city. Liam Harrison, the reclusive billionaire, had built an empire through sheer willpower, ruthlessness, and an unflinching commitment to control. At 36, his life was a testament to precision, discipline, and success, yet there was a hollowness to it all that even he couldn't deny. Liam's mansion was a masterpiece of architecture, designed to intimidate and inspire. Towering spires and intricate carvings adorned the exterior, while the inside was meticulously maintained, every detail curated to perfection. Yet, despite its grandeur, the house felt lifeless, more a fortress than a home. To the outside world, Liam was an enigmatic figure admired for his sharp business acumen and feared for his unyielding approach to negotiation. Few dared to question him, and even fewer understood the man behind the icy exterior. It wasn't always like this. Once upon a time, Liam had been a different man, one who laughed freely and embraced life's unpredictability. But time and betrayal had carved deep scars into his soul, leading him to shut the world out. Emotions, he had decided, were dangerous distractions that only invited pain. Instead, he poured his energy into his work, creating an empire that served as both a monument to his brilliance and a shield from the vulnerabilities of the heart. Love, friendship, and trust were luxuries he could no longer afford. That fateful autumn, a new presence entered the Harrison estate. Charlotte Hayes, a young woman of 25, arrived on a rainy Monday morning, her heart a mix of hope and trepidation. Hailing from a small town in Ohio, Charlotte had grown up shouldering responsibilities far beyond her years. Her mother's chronic illness had forced her to work tirelessly from a young age, instilling in her a quiet strength and an unshakable determination to provide for her family. She had been hired as the estate's housekeeper, a modest yet crucial role in maintaining the perfection Liam demanded. Charlotte's first impressions of the estate were of awe and intimidation. The house was massive, with high ceilings, intricate woodwork, and an overwhelming sense of history. Mrs. Thorne, the head housekeeper, was the epitome of efficiency and discipline. Under her watchful eye, Charlotte quickly adapted to the routines of the mansion, her days filled with cleaning, organizing, and ensuring that every surface gleamed as if it were brand new. For the first week, she never saw Liam. He was either away or locked in his office. His presence felt only through the whispers of staff and the occasional distant sound of footsteps. But whispers were enough to paint a vivid picture of the man. Mr. Harrison likes things a certain way, Mrs. Thorne had warned Charlotte sternly. He's not one for conversation or niceties. Just do your job, and you'll be fine. Charlotte, who was used to difficult circumstances, nodded and went about her work. She had no expectations of friendliness or gratitude from her employer. All she wanted was to do her job well and send money home to her mother. Charlotte's life at the mansion might have continued uneventfully if not for an unexpected storm one afternoon. Heavy rains flooded the city, forcing Liam to cancel an important meeting and return home early. As he entered the marble-floored hallway, he was greeted by an unfamiliar sight. Charlotte, kneeling on the floor, meticulously scrubbing away a scuff mark. Her dark brown hair was tied back, and her delicate features bore an expression of quiet concentration. For a moment, Liam paused, watching her with a curious detachment. "Who are you?" His deep, commanding voice broke the silence, startling Charlotte. She stood up quickly, almost losing her grip on the cleaning supplies, and turned to face him. He was even more imposing in person, tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his sharp features framed by a seriousness that bordered on severity. His piercing gaze seemed to evaluate her in an instant, and she felt suddenly small under its intensity. "I'm Charlotte, sir. The new housekeeper," she replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She had always been good at masking her nerves. Liam's eyes narrowed slightly as he nodded. "Don't get in the way," he said curtly, before walking past her and disappearing into his office. It was a brief encounter, yet it left an impression on both of them. Charlotte couldn't shake the image of his cold, commanding demeanor, while Liam found himself vaguely unsettled by the unexpected presence of someone so unassuming yet so composed. In the days that followed, their paths crossed more frequently. Liam's routine was as rigid as the man himself, mornings spent in his office, afternoons at business meetings, and evenings in solitary reflection. Charlotte, meanwhile, moved quietly through the mansion, her diligence and efficiency earning Mrs. Thorne's approval. Although their interactions were limited to polite nods and brief instructions, both began to notice the other in ways they hadn't anticipated. Liam observed how Charlotte carried herself with quiet dignity, never seeking attention or approval. Unlike others who worked for him, she didn't attempt to ingratiate herself or fear his presence. She simply did her job, and she did it well. Yet there was something about her, the way her eyes seemed to hold a world of resilience, the way she moved with purpose despite the weight she must have carried. He found himself curious, though he couldn't explain why. Charlotte, on the other hand, couldn't help but be intrigued by Liam's contradictions. He was distant and aloof, yet there were moments when his guard seemed to slip, a fleeting softness in his gaze, a sigh that hinted at exhaustion rather than anger. He was a man of immense power and wealth, yet he seemed profoundly alone, as if the walls he had built to protect himself had become a prison. It was a loneliness she recognized, having experienced it in her own way growing up. Their unspoken observations of each other were like threads slowly weaving a connection neither had anticipated. For Liam, who had spent years avoiding any form of vulnerability, the quiet presence of Charlotte was both unsettling and strangely comforting. For Charlotte, Liam's aloofness was a mystery she didn't intend to solve but couldn't entirely ignore. And so, beneath the cold, grey skies of autumn, a subtle shift began. It was imperceptible to anyone else, but within the Harrison estate, two lives were beginning to converge, drawn together by something neither fully understood. What started as a simple employment arrangement was becoming the foundation of a story that would challenge them both to confront their fears, open their hearts, and redefine what it meant to truly live. The days following Charlotte's brief encounter with Liam were marked by a growing tension in the mansion. Not an overt, uncomfortable tension, but a silent, almost imperceptible shift in the air. Charlotte went about her work as she always had, meticulous and focused, but she couldn't help the lingering thoughts of her enigmatic employer. And Liam, he, too, was aware of a presence in his home that unsettled him, though he would never admit it aloud. It was on a chilly morning a week later when their interactions took another unexpected turn. Charlotte was cleaning Liam's office, a task she had come to both dread and look forward to. The room was a reflection of the man who inhabited it, orderly, imposing, and unyieldingly practical. The dark wooden shelves were lined with financial tomes and reports, with no trace of personal memorabilia. Yet, there was one anomaly that caught her eye, a book left open on the desk. She paused for a moment, curious despite herself. It was Wuthering Heights. The weathered edges and the bookmarked page surprised her, It was hardly the type of book she would have imagined Liam reading. Gently, she picked it up and glanced at the highlighted passage. The words spoke of love, pain, and the inescapable bonds of human connection. It was a momentary glimpse into something deeper, a contradiction to the cold, detached figure she had come to know. She barely had time to set the book back down when the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Liam appeared in the doorway, his sharp eyes immediately narrowing in on her. He crossed the room with measured steps, his gaze darting between her and the book. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low but laced with discomfort. Charlotte's cheeks flushed as she fumbled for a response. "I was just cleaning, sir." The book was open. "And she stopped herself, unsure how much to reveal. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the book back on the desk. Liam picked it up, closing it with deliberate care. For a moment, the silence between them was palpable, heavy with unspoken words. His usual stoic expression faltered ever so slightly, as though he were weighing whether to reprimand her or explain himself. "Curiosity can be dangerous, Miss Hayes," he said finally, his tone returning to its familiar coldness. Yet, there was something in his eyes that didn't match his words. A flicker of vulnerability, quickly extinguished. Charlotte nodded, muttering an apology before retreating from the office. But even as she left, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen something in Liam, a crack in his armor. She didn't understand why it mattered to her, but it did. For Liam, the interaction lingered long after she had gone. He chastised himself for leaving the book out, for allowing a piece of himself to be exposed. However unintentionally, he had spent years perfecting the art of control, ensuring that no one could see past the facade he had built. And yet, in that moment, Charlotte had glimpsed something real, a part of him he hadn't shown anyone in a very long time. Over the following days, they continued their dance of cautious interactions. Charlotte remained professional, her movements calculated to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Liam, meanwhile, found himself watching her more often than he cared to admit. He noticed the quiet efficiency with which she worked, the way her expression softened when she thought no one was looking. She wasn't like anyone else who had worked for him. She didn't try to please him, nor did she cower in his presence. She simply existed in his world, quietly yet undeniably. One rainy evening, as the staff prepared dinner, Charlotte found herself setting the dining room table. The rhythmic sound of the rain against the windows created a soothing backdrop as she arranged the silverware with precision. She was lost in her thoughts when a voice behind her made her start. "Do you enjoy working here?" She turned to see Liam standing in the doorway, his hands in his pockets and his expression unreadable. It was the first time he had asked her anything remotely personal, and it caught her off guard. "It's a good job, sir," she replied, carefully choosing her words. "I'm grateful for the opportunity." He nodded, stepping further into the room. "Grateful," he repeated, as though testing the word. "Is that all?" Charlotte hesitated. "It's peaceful here," she admitted finally. "Sometimes I miss the noise of home, but the quiet has its own comfort." Liam's gaze lingered on her, and for a moment, it seemed as though he wanted to say something more. Instead, he simply nodded again and left the room, his footsteps fading into the distance. Charlotte exhaled, unaware she had been holding her breath. His question, though simple, had unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. That night, as she lay in her modest quarters, Charlotte replayed the encounter in her mind. Liam Harrison was a puzzle, one she wasn't sure she wanted to solve, yet couldn't seem to ignore. His presence was magnetic, drawing her in even as she tried to maintain her boundaries. She wondered what had made him the way he was, so closed off, so unwilling to let anyone in. For Liam, the evening was equally restless. He sat in his office, staring at the same book that had sparked their earlier exchange. His thoughts were uncharacteristically scattered, drawn to Charlotte's words and the quiet strength she seemed to embody. She was different. And that difference unnerved him. She had managed to slip past the walls he had spent years constructing. And he wasn't sure how to stop it, or if he even wanted to. As the rain continued to fall outside, both Liam and Charlotte found themselves grappling with the same question: what happens when two lives, so carefully controlled and so vastly different, begin to intertwine? Neither had the answer. But the seeds of change had been sown. And neither could deny that something was beginning to bloom. The days that followed were marked by subtle yet undeniable shifts between Charlotte and Liam. The mansion, with its grand hallways and meticulously maintained rooms, became the backdrop for a connection neither of them had anticipated nor fully understood. Though they continued to interact professionally, each shared moment seemed charged with a quiet intensity, a mutual awareness of the other that neither could ignore. One afternoon, Charlotte found herself in the garden, trimming the overgrown rose bushes. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of impending rain, and the sound of birdsong filled the otherwise silent grounds. The garden was one of the few places where Charlotte felt entirely at ease. It was a space untainted by Liam's watchful eyes, a sanctuary where she could momentarily forget the complicated tension growing between them. Yet, as if fate had other plans, she soon heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. Turning, she saw Liam striding toward her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored coat. The sight of him in the natural light, with the sharp angles of his face softened by the pale sun, caught her off guard. He rarely ventured into the garden, preferring the sterile order of his office to the unpredictable beauty of the outdoors. "Miss Hayes," he said, his tone as formal as ever. "I didn't expect to find you out here." Charlotte straightened, brushing her dirt-streaked hands against her apron. "The roses needed attention," she replied, her voice steady despite the quickening of her heartbeat. Liam nodded, his gaze sweeping over the garden. "It looks different," he admitted, as though seeing it for the first time. "I can't recall the last time I came out here." "It's a beautiful space," Charlotte offered. "It just needs a little care." He turned his attention back to her, his eyes thoughtful. "And you seem to care about it." "I do," she admitted. "I find it peaceful." Liam hesitated, as if weighing whether to continue the conversation or retreat to the safety of his office. But something about the stillness of the moment compelled him to stay. "You're different from the others who've worked here," he said finally. Charlotte tilted her head, unsure how to interpret his words. "Different, sir?" He nodded. "Most people try to impress me or, at the very least, avoid drawing my attention. You don't seem to care what I think of you." Charlotte's lips curved into a faint smile. "With respect, sir, I don't believe my job requires me to win your approval. I'm here to work, not to gain favor." Liam's brow furrowed, but his expression wasn't one of displeasure. If anything, he seemed intrigued. "Honest," he remarked. "It's rare. I wasn't aware honesty was so unusual." Charlotte replied, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly. "Perhaps that says more about the people around you than about me." Liam stared at her for a long moment, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. "Perhaps," he conceded. The silence that followed was surprisingly comfortable. Charlotte returned to pruning the roses, and Liam remained nearby, watching her with an intensity that made her self-conscious despite herself. She could feel his gaze, steady and unyielding, and yet there was no malice in it, only curiosity, perhaps even admiration. As the minutes stretched on, Liam finally spoke again. "I've built my life around control," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "It's easier that way. Predictable. Safe." Charlotte paused, glancing up at him. There was a vulnerability in his tone that she hadn't heard before, and it drew her in despite her better judgment. "But safe isn't the same as happy," she said softly. Liam's lips pressed into a thin line. "No, it's not." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Charlotte wanted to ask him more. to understand the man behind the carefully constructed facade. But she knew better than to push. Liam was like a fortress, and while she had glimpsed cracks in his walls, she wasn't sure if he was ready or willing to let her in. When he finally turned to leave, he paused and looked back at her. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Charlotte asked, genuinely surprised. He hesitated, then gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "For reminding me." Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, leaving her alone with the roses and the questions that now swirled in her mind. That evening, as Charlotte prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the memory of their conversation. Liam Harrison was an enigma, a man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders but refused to let anyone share the burden. And yet, in that brief moment in the garden, she had seen something real, something raw and human. It made her heart ache in a way she didn't fully understand. For Liam, the interaction had been equally unsettling. As he sat in his dimly lit study, nursing a glass of scotch, he replayed Charlotte's words in his mind. Safe isn't the same as happy. It was a truth he had spent years avoiding, burying himself in work and wealth to avoid confronting the emptiness he felt. But Charlotte had a way of peeling back the layers he had so carefully constructed, and he wasn't sure if he resented her for it or needed her because of it. As the night stretched on, both Liam and Charlotte found themselves staring out into the darkness, lost in thought. They were two very different people, living in two very different worlds. And yet, for the first time, it felt as though those worlds were beginning to collide. Neither knew where it would lead, but neither could deny the pull that seemed to draw them closer with each passing day. The days continued with an air of quiet tension that neither Charlotte nor Liam could ignore. Though their interactions remained professional, there was an unspoken connection growing between them, a current that simmered beneath the surface. The once impenetrable walls Liam had built around himself seemed to shift, letting in glimpses of vulnerability he had long buried. And Charlotte, despite her attempts to remain composed, found herself drawn to the man behind the mask. One evening, after most of the staff had retired for the night, Charlotte stayed late to finish polishing the dining room's silverware. The grand chandelier above cast a warm glow over the table. But the task felt endless. She sighed softly, stretching her sore shoulders, when the sound of footsteps broke the stillness. She turned to find Liam standing in the doorway. He was dressed casually for once, in a dark sweater and trousers, his usual air of authority tempered by the relaxed attire. There was a faint crease in his brow, and he held a glass of wine in one hand, as if he had wandered in by accident. "Still working, Miss Hayes?" he asked, his voice low but carrying a note of genuine curiosity. Charlotte straightened, her cheeks warming slightly at his unexpected presence. "Just finishing up," she replied, placing a polished spoon on the table. "It's quieter in the evenings." Liam stepped further into the room, his gaze sweeping over the gleaming silverware and the meticulously set table. "You're thorough," he remarked, though there was no hint of criticism in his tone. Instead, it almost sounded like admiration. "I try to be," Charlotte said, her hands nervously fiddling with a cloth. "It's important to do things properly, don't you think?" Liam chuckled softly, a sound she rarely heard. "You remind me of someone I once knew," he said, his eyes distant. "She always insisted on doing things the right way, no matter how difficult it was." Charlotte hesitated, sensing the shift in his tone. "Someone important to you?" she asked gently. He nodded, his expression clouding. "My mother," he admitted after a pause. "She was everything I'm not. Kind, patient, selfless. I've tried to live up to her example." But he stopped himself, as though he'd said too much. Charlotte's heart softened at his admission. She hadn't expected him to open up, and the vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. "I think you're more like her than you realize," she said quietly. Liam raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on his lips. "And what makes you say that?" "You care about the people around you," Charlotte said, meeting his gaze. Even if you don't show it in obvious ways, you have a strong sense of responsibility. That's not nothing. For a moment, Liam seemed to struggle with her words, as if they were foreign to him. He had spent so long believing he was cold and unfeeling. Yet Charlotte's perspective challenged that notion. You see things others don't. Miss Hayes, he said finally. Maybe that's because others aren't looking, she replied. Her tone light but her words carrying weight. Liam set his glass down on the table and leaned against the chair opposite her. His posture uncharacteristically relaxed. You've been here for weeks. And yet I still know so little about you, he said. His gaze fixed on her. Why is that? Charlotte blinked, caught off guard by the question. I suppose there's not much to tell, she said, though the nervous lilt in her voice betrayed her. I doubt that, Liam said, his eyes narrowing slightly. You have a way of carrying yourself, as if the world has tried to knock you down, but you've refused to let it. Charlotte felt a lump form in her throat. His words struck closer to the truth than she was comfortable admitting. Everyone has their struggles, she said carefully. I'm no different. Liam studied her for a long moment, as though trying to piece together a puzzle. You're different, he said softly, almost to himself. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Charlotte wanted to ask him what he meant, but she couldn't find the words. And Liam, for all his intelligence and eloquence, seemed equally at a loss. Finally, he straightened and picked up his glass again. I've taken up enough of your time, he said, his voice returning to its usual measured tone. Good night, Miss Hayes. Good night, Mr. Harrison, she replied, watching as he disappeared into the hallway. When he was gone, Charlotte let out a shaky breath. Her heart was pounding, and her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Liam Harrison, the man who had once seemed so untouchable, was becoming increasingly human in her eyes. And with each layer he revealed, she found herself falling further into a connection she wasn't sure she could escape. For Liam, the encounter left him equally unsettled. As he returned to his study, he found himself pacing, unable to focus on the documents waiting on his desk. Charlotte's words lingered in his mind, cutting through the fog of doubt he had carried for years. She saw something in him that no one else did, and the thought both terrified and exhilarated him. By the time the night gave way to dawn, both Liam and Charlotte were left grappling with emotions they hadn't anticipated. Their lives, once so carefully controlled, were now veering into uncharted territory, and though neither could predict where it would lead, one thing was certain: they were no longer the same people they had been before. The following days at the Harrison estate unfolded with a rhythm both familiar and unfamiliar. The usual routines of cleaning, organizing, and maintaining the grandeur of the mansion continued. But the air between Charlotte and Liam was charged with an invisible tension. It wasn't a tension of hostility but something much harder to define. A mix of curiosity, caution, and an unspoken yearning that neither dared to name. For Charlotte, every encounter with Liam felt like walking a tightrope. She was aware of the boundary between them, a line drawn not just by their professional roles but also by the worlds they inhabited. Yet, despite her attempts to keep things formal, she couldn't ignore the way her heart raced whenever Liam's gaze lingered on her a moment too long or how her mind replayed their brief conversations late into the night. Liam, on the other hand, found himself increasingly distracted. The man who had once prided himself on his unshakable focus now struggled to concentrate on even the simplest of tasks. His thoughts often wandered back to Charlotte, her quiet strength, her quick wit, the way her presence seemed to fill the empty spaces of his home. He told himself it was a passing fascination, a fleeting interest that would fade with time. But deep down, he knew better. One evening, the storm clouds that had been gathering all day finally broke, unleashing a torrential downpour. The rain lashed against the mansion's windows, and the occasional rumble of thunder echoed through its halls. Most of the staff had retired for the night, but Charlotte remained in the library, organizing the shelves as part of her weekly tasks. The room was warm and inviting, the soft glow of the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. As she reached for a high shelf, the sound of footsteps startled her. She turned to see Liam standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the flickering light. He seemed hesitant, almost out of place, as if he hadn't planned to find her there. "Working late again, Miss Hayes?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Charlotte offered a small smile. "There's always something to be done," she replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "What about you, Mr. Harrison? Shouldn't you be resting?" Liam stepped further into the room, his hands tucked into his pockets. "I find it difficult to sleep during storms," he admitted, his gaze drifting to the rain-soaked windows. "The quiet moments afterward are better." Charlotte nodded, understanding the sentiment. "They do have a way of clearing the air," she said softly, returning her focus to the books. "Though I imagine your mind is rarely quiet." Liam chuckled lightly, a sound that made her pause. "You've noticed, have you?" "It's hard not to," she said, glancing at him. "You carry the weight of so much, Mr. Harrison. It's no wonder you find it hard to rest." For a moment, Liam didn't respond. He watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. Then he crossed the room to stand near the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames. "Do you ever feel like you're living a life that isn't yours?" he asked suddenly, his voice quieter now. Charlotte blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I'm not sure what you mean." Liam turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. "Everything I have, this house, my business, my reputation, it all feels like a role I'm playing. Something I've built to protect myself. But sometimes I wonder if it's all just a facade." Charlotte hesitated, sensing the vulnerability in his words. She had always seen Liam as a man of control and certainty, but now he seemed like someone grappling with doubts he could no longer ignore. "I think," she said carefully, "we all wear masks to some extent. They help us navigate the world, protect us from being hurt. But the danger is when we forget who we are underneath." Liam considered her words, his jaw tightening slightly. "And what if you're not sure who that person is anymore?" Charlotte took a step closer, her voice steady but filled with empathy. "Then maybe it's time to find out." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Liam looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, and Charlotte felt the weight of his gaze. It was as though the walls he had so carefully constructed were beginning to crumble, leaving him exposed in a way he had never allowed himself to be. "I don't know how you do it," he said finally, his tone soft. "You see through people, past the things they try to hide. It's disarming." Charlotte smiled faintly, though her heart was racing. "It's not a skill, Mr. Harrison. It's just paying attention." "Call me Liam," he said, his voice almost a whisper. The intimacy of the moment hung in the air, and Charlotte found herself at a loss for words. She nodded slightly, her cheeks warming, and returned to her task. But the simple exchange had shifted something between them, something neither could deny. As the storm outside began to subside, Liam lingered for a while longer before finally retreating to his study. Charlotte watched him go, her emotions a whirlwind. She knew the path they were on was fraught with complications. But for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if it might lead to something worth the risk. For Liam, the evening left him with more questions than answers. As he sat alone in his study, the rain still pattering softly against the windows, he couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully ordered life was about to change in ways he had never anticipated. And for once, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to stop it. The morning after the storm, the mansion seemed unusually still. The rain had left the gardens glistening under the pale sunlight, and a soft breeze carried the scent of wet earth. Charlotte went about her usual tasks, but her thoughts lingered on the conversation she had shared with Liam the previous night. His vulnerability, so unexpected and raw, had stirred something within her, a desire to understand him better. to see the man behind the carefully constructed walls. Liam, too, was restless. His mind replayed their exchange as he sat in his office. Surrounded by papers he couldn't bring himself to focus on. Charlotte's words had struck a chord, one that resonated with a truth he had long tried to suppress. He had always prided himself on his control, on the fortress he had built around his emotions. But now, for the first time in years, he felt the cracks beginning to show, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to mend them. Their paths crossed again that afternoon in the library. Charlotte was dusting the shelves when Liam entered. His steps hesitant. He seemed to pause at the threshold, as if debating whether to proceed, before finally stepping inside. "You're becoming a regular in the library, Mr. Harrison," Charlotte said lightly, not looking up from her work. "I find it peaceful," Liam replied, his voice subdued. He moved to the large oak desk near the window, absently running his fingers over its surface. "And please, it's Liam. I meant it." Charlotte straightened, her heart skipping at the sincerity in his tone. "Liam." Then she said, her voice soft but steady. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet was filled only with the rustle of leaves outside and the faint creak of the old mansion settling into itself. Finally, Liam broke the silence. "Charlotte," he began, his tone uncertain. "Do you ever wonder if the choices you've made have led you too far from who you wanted to be?" She paused, setting down her cloth and turning to face him. His question felt like an echo of the one he had posed the night before, but this time it carried an added weight. His guarded expression betrayed a flicker of something deeper: doubt, perhaps, or regret. "I think we all have moments like that," she said thoughtfully. "But I also believe it's never too late to change course. If you're brave enough to face the truth, you can always find your way back." Liam's lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes remained distant. "Brave," he murmured, almost to himself. "I'm not sure I would use that word to describe myself." "I would," Charlotte said, surprising them both. Her cheeks flushed, but she held his gaze. "It takes courage to admit you're not happy, to question the life you've built. Most people wouldn't dare." Liam's expression softened, and for a moment, the weight he carried seemed to lift. "You have a way of making things sound so simple," he said quietly. "Maybe they are," she replied with a small smile. "We just like to complicate them." The simplicity of her words struck him. Liam had spent years entangled in the complexities of his business empire, navigating deals and power plays that left little room for anything else. But here, in this quiet room with Charlotte, he found himself longing for something far removed from all that, something genuine, untainted by ambition or pretense. As the afternoon light shifted, painting the walls with golden hues, Liam found himself opening up in ways he hadn't anticipated. He spoke of his childhood, of the expectations that had been placed on him from an early age. He talked about the loss of his parents, a grief he had buried beneath layers of responsibility and detachment. And though his voice remained measured, Charlotte could see the pain etched into his features. "You've carried so much alone," she said softly when he finished. "But you don't have to anymore." Her words hung in the air, and Liam felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent so long convincing himself that solitude was strength, that vulnerability was weakness. But now, faced with Charlotte's quiet understanding, he wondered if he had been wrong all along. "You're remarkable, Charlotte," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You see things in people that they can't even see in themselves." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. "I think we're all looking for someone who sees us," she said. "The real us." Liam didn't respond, but the intensity of his gaze spoke volumes. In that moment, Charlotte felt the fragile barrier between them begin to dissolve. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The prospect of what might lie ahead if they allowed themselves to step beyond the confines of their roles. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room, Liam finally stood. Thank you, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. For listening. For everything. Charlotte smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. Anytime. Liam. He lingered for a moment before nodding and leaving the room. As the door closed behind him, Charlotte let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She knew the road ahead would be complicated, fraught with challenges neither of them could yet foresee. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that, together, they might be able to navigate whatever came their way. The mansion seemed quieter after Liam's departure, the silence almost reflective. Charlotte resumed her work, but her thoughts remained with him, with the unspoken connection that had begun to form between them. It was fragile, like the first bloom of spring, but it was real. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed brought subtle yet significant changes to the rhythm of life within the mansion. Liam, who had always seemed like a distant storm cloud hovering over the estate, began to appear more often in common areas, his previously impenetrable demeanor softening just enough to be noticed. Charlotte, ever discreet, went about her duties as diligently as always. But even she couldn't ignore the shift in their dynamic. It was in the quiet moments, the shared glances, and the unspoken understanding that the change was most evident. Liam's presence, once commanding and intimidating, now carried a sense of curiosity and an unexpected warmth. He seemed more at ease, less tethered to the weight of his empire. And Charlotte, though cautious, found herself drawn to him in ways she hadn't anticipated. One evening, as Charlotte finished tidying the library, she noticed Liam seated near the fireplace, a glass of brandy in hand. The flickering flames cast shadows across his face, highlighting the lines of thought etched into his features. He seemed lost in contemplation, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Long day?" Charlotte asked, her voice soft but breaking the silence. Liam glanced up, his expression briefly startled before settling into something gentler. "Long life," he replied with a faint smile, gesturing for her to join him. "Stay a moment. If you're not in a rush." Charlotte hesitated but then took a seat across from him, her hands resting lightly in her lap. The atmosphere in the room was unusually intimate, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. "I've been thinking," Liam began, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "about what you said the other day. How we complicate things." Charlotte tilted her head, curious. And I wonder if I've spent my entire life doing just that," he admitted, his tone laced with both frustration and wonder. "Building walls, creating distance, convincing myself it was the only way to survive. It worked," Charlotte offered gently. "You've built something remarkable. At what cost?" Liam countered, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Yes, I've built an empire. But the higher the walls, the lonelier it's become. Sometimes I wonder if I've built myself a prison instead of a sanctuary." Charlotte's heart ached at the vulnerability in his words. For all his success and power, Liam seemed adrift, searching for something he couldn't name. She wanted to offer him solace, to tell him he wasn't alone, but she knew the value of letting him find his own answers. "What about you?" Liam asked suddenly, his eyes meeting hers. "You've spoken of your family, of your mother's struggles. But what about you? What do you dream of?" Charlotte. The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that, not in the way Liam did, with genuine curiosity and an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't before. "I don't know if I've allowed myself to dream," she admitted, her voice quiet. "Life has always been about getting by, about doing what needs to be done. Dreams felt like a luxury I couldn't afford." Liam leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "You deserve more than that," he said firmly. "You deserve to dream, to have a life that's more than just survival." Charlotte felt a lump rise in her throat, his words stirring something deep within her. "And what about you?" she asked, deflecting slightly. "What do you dream of?" Liam. He hesitated, the question clearly unsettling him. Finally, he set his glass down and leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I dream of peace, he said after a long pause. Of freedom from expectations. From responsibilities. From myself. Charlotte's breath caught at the rawness of his answer. It was a confession as much as a revelation. And it made her see Liam in a new light. For all his strength and control, he was still a man burdened by the weight of his own choices. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, it was contemplative. Heavy with the unspoken truths that lingered between them. Finally, Liam spoke again. His voice softer this time. You make me question everything I thought I knew about myself, he said. And that terrifies me. Charlotte's pulse quickened. But she forced herself to stay calm. Why does it terrify you? Because I've spent so long avoiding this, he admitted. Avoiding feelings. Connections. Anything that might make me vulnerable. And now, here you are, breaking through all of it without even trying. Charlotte didn't know how to respond. She felt the intensity of his words, the weight of what he was revealing, and it left her both exhilarated and apprehensive. She wanted to reach out, to reassure him. But she also knew how fragile this moment was. I don't mean to make things harder for you, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I just want to help. Liam's lips quirked into a faint smile, though his eyes remained serious. You're not making things harder, Charlotte. You're making them better. But better isn't always easier. Their conversation hung in the air as the fire crackled softly, casting warm light across the room. For a moment, it felt as though the rest of the world had faded away, leaving only the two of them and the uncharted territory they were beginning to explore together. As Charlotte rose to leave, Liam reached out, his hand brushing hers lightly. Thank you, he said, his voice sincere. For what? She asked, surprised. For staying, he replied simply, and as she walked away, her heart filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Charlotte couldn't help but wonder where this path would lead them next. The morning after their quiet conversation by the fire, the mansion seemed to carry a different energy. Charlotte felt it as she moved through the grand hallways, her footsteps muffled by the plush carpets. The air was heavy with the unspoken, and every encounter with Liam seemed to carry a new kind of tension, a tension laced with possibility. Liam, true to his character, buried himself in his work. His office door remained closed for most of the day, the faint sound of his deep voice occasionally seeping through as he conducted meetings. Yet, even in his distance, Charlotte couldn't shake the weight of his confession from the night before. You make me question everything I thought I knew about myself. The words replayed in her mind, stirring emotions she couldn't fully define. She had always viewed Liam as a fortress, impenetrable and steadfast. But now, she glimpsed the man behind the walls, a man burdened by loneliness and yearning for something he couldn't quite articulate. By mid-afternoon, Charlotte found herself in the garden, her sanctuary within the sprawling estate. The late spring air was warm, the sunlight dappling the stone paths as it filtered through the trees. She knelt by the flower beds, her hands busy with pruning shears. But her mind was elsewhere. It wasn't just Liam's vulnerability that haunted her, it was her own. In opening up to him, even just a little, she had exposed parts of herself she had long kept hidden. Lost in thought again? The voice startled her, and she turned to see Liam standing a few feet away, his hands tucked into his pockets. He looked less formal than usual, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his tie absent. It was a small change, but it made him seem more approachable, more human. Just enjoying the garden, Charlotte replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. It's peaceful out here. Liam nodded, stepping closer. I can see why you like it. It's grounding. Charlotte watched as he crouched down beside her, his usually composed demeanor replaced by a rare sense of ease. He picked up a stray twig, turning it over in his hands, his expression contemplative. You've been busy today, Charlotte said, breaking the silence. Always, Liam replied, a hint of weariness in his tone. But I wanted to check on you. After last night, I wasn't sure how you felt about everything I said. Charlotte hesitated, unsure of how to put her feelings into words. I'm still processing, she admitted. You've been so closed off. And now it's like you're letting me see a completely different side of you. It's a lot to take in. Liam's lips curved into a faint smile. You're not the only one who's overwhelmed. Trust me. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the soft rustling of leaves filling the space between them. Finally, Liam spoke again, his voice quieter now. I don't want to scare you away, Charlotte. I know I can be intense, but I meant what I said. You've changed something in me, and I don't know how to go back to who I was before. Charlotte's chest tightened at his words. She had always admired Liam's strength, his determination. But hearing him admit his vulnerability made her feel closer to him than ever before. I don't think you should go back, she said softly. I think this openness, it's good for you. It's good for both of us. Liam looked at her, his piercing gaze softened by something she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, perhaps. Or maybe hope. You make it sound so simple, he said with a wry smile. It's not, Charlotte replied. But it's worth it. Liam reached out then, his hand brushing against hers. It was a tentative gesture, one that spoke volumes about his struggle to balance his instincts for control with his newfound willingness to let someone in. Charlotte didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over, letting their fingers intertwine. For the first time, Liam Sterling, the man who had built his life on solitude and discipline, allowed himself to simply be, to sit in the garden with Charlotte and feel the sun on his skin, the warmth of her hand in his. It was a small moment, but it carried the weight of something monumental. As the afternoon wore on, their conversation turned lighter, drifting to topics of little consequence. They talked about the garden, about books they'd read, and about the quirks of the household staff. For a while, it felt as though they were just two people, unburdened by the expectations and complications that usually surrounded them. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the garden, reality began to creep back in. Liam's phone buzzed with a message, a reminder of the business waiting for him in his office. Charlotte's responsibilities called her back to the mansion as well. Yet, as they rose to leave, neither could deny that something had shifted between them. Thank you for this, Liam said, his voice low. For listening. For staying. Charlotte met his gaze, her heart full. Always. As they walked back to the mansion side by side, Charlotte couldn't help but feel that they were on the brink of something new. It was a precarious place, full of uncertainties and risks, but also brimming with possibilities. For the first time in years, Charlotte allowed herself to hope not just for Liam, but for herself as well. As the sun set behind the Sterling estate, casting a golden glow across the sprawling grounds, Liam and Charlotte stood together on the balcony, looking out at the horizon. The journey they had shared was far from conventional, two souls from different worlds, brought together by fate and held together by the courage to face their vulnerabilities. For Liam, the once impenetrable fortress of his heart now harbored a quiet warmth. He had found strength not in his solitude, but in Charlotte's unwavering belief in him. For Charlotte, the journey had shown her that love could exist without compromising her independence, a partnership built on trust, respect, and the willingness to face life's storms together. I never thought this was possible, Liam said, his voice soft but resolute. Charlotte turned to him, her eyes glistening with emotion. Neither did I. But sometimes, life surprises us. As their hands intertwined, it was clear that the future, though uncertain, was a path they were ready to walk together. This is more than just a story of love, it's a testament to the power of vulnerability, resilience, and the beauty of connection. Subscribe to Life Stories to follow more heartfelt journeys like this one. See you in the next story.